They said she talked like her mouth was full of stones. They laughed. They mocked. They turned their backs, until one man stepped forward and said, "To me, it sounds like home." Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a Western town thick with prejudice, about an immigrant girl whose voice no one understood, and about a cowboy who'd lost everything, but still had the courage to recognize what truly mattered. Not gold, not land, but a voice his heart could never forget. The sun over Dry Creek beat down like a punishment that mid-June morning, hard and merciless. The wooden porches groaned under its heat, and dust clung to everything it touched. Even the dogs lay still, their tongues lolling in the shade, too tired to bark. Inside the general store, the air was barely cooler, and outside, people shifted and murmured with sluggish discontent. Then it happened, sudden and sharp. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Lucinda Holloway, standing too long in the sun, in her dark Sunday dress, gave a soft gasp and crumpled forward, like a sheet gone slack. Her basket of greens scattered across the planks. For a heartbeat, nobody fleed. Not her husband still arguing over the price of flour inside. Not the two boys whittling near the steps. Not even the storekeeper who watched it all from the doorway. Only one figure stirred. Anka Vetrova moved quickly, her shadow cutting across the boards. She wasn't tall, but she moved with a kind of quiet certainty that startled those nearby. In her plain blue dress and wide-brimmed bonnet, she knelt beside Lucinda without hesitation. Her voice, soft but firm, rose in clipped consonants and rounded vowels, foreign, strange to the ears of Dry Creek. "Please give space. She need air." "I help." The boys snickered. "She talks like she's chewing on rocks," one of them muttered. Another man, round in the gut and red in the cheeks, leaned against the post and called out louder. "What did she say? Can't make heads or tails of it. Maybe if she spoke English proper, we'd know what she's even trying to say." The laughter rose like flies to carrion. Anka did not look at them. Her hands moved with care, loosening Lucinda's collar, lifting her shoulders slightly, fanning her gently with a folded scrap of newspaper. Her cheeks burned, but not from the heat. She knew that tone, mockery dressed as amusement, sharpened to wound. "Maybe she cast some of that gypsy magic on her," one of the bystanders added with a dry chuckle. "Ain't that what them Eastern girls do then?" A voice, calm but edged with iron, cut through the air like a whip. She was mocked for her accent, it said. The cowboy said, "To me it sounds like home." Heads turned. The crowd stilled. Dylan Sprouse stood at the edge of the saloon porch, tall and lean, a shadow cast long by the high sun. He had one boot on the top step, his thumbs hooked through his belt, and his hat tipped just enough to show the sharpness in his eyes. The men shrank slightly under his gaze. Dylan Sprouse wasn't known for speaking often, but when he did, folks tended to listen. He wasn't the kind to raise his voice, but he didn't need to. One of the younger boys cleared his throat and stepped back. The man at the post tried to look anywhere but at Dylan. Dylan stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the dirt hard. He crossed the space slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside Anka, who was still kneeling. "You all right, miss?" he asked, quieter now. Anka looked up. Her eyes, a pale gray blue, met his. She nodded once. "I am," she said. Her accent colored every syllable, soft but distinct. "She is better now. Just too hot." Lucinda stirred slightly, groaned. "I'll help you get her inside," Dylan said, glancing over at the storekeeper, who finally stepped forward. Anka stood, her hands brushing off her apron. She didn't meet the eyes of the men who had laughed, didn't speak to them. Dylan, however, turned toward them. "You boys mocking someone for how they talk," he said, calm but sharp. "That what passes for fun now?" No one answered. He took a step closer. "My mother spoke with an accent," he continued. "Alsatian. She was the kindest woman I ever knew. You mocking her too." There was a shuffle of boots, Someone muttered something about just teasing. Dylan didn't flinch. Sounds more like you're trying to feel taller by making someone else small. Another silence, heavier now. Dylan turned back to Anka, his expression softening. I'll walk you back if you'd like, he said. I can manage, she replied quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. Still, he said, I'd feel better seeing you there. She nodded. They walked down the main street side by side. People watched but said nothing. Dust kicked up beneath their boots. Dylan didn't speak unless she did. Anka carried herself with rigid grace, arms folded tight, like she expected something to hit her from behind. At the edge of town stood a small house, really more a shack, where she lived with old Ezra. The cottonwoods out front were dry and thin-leaved, but cast enough shade to make the steps feel cooler. She turned at the door. Thank you, she said. Dylan tipped his hat. No one should have to explain why they sound the way they do. Anka hesitated. Your mother. She sound like me. He smiled slow and real. She used to say the word bread, like it had 4 syllables. I haven't heard that in years. Anka's lips parted slightly in surprise. You miss her. Every day. She nodded almost imperceptibly, then stepped inside. The door closed gently behind her. Dylan stood on the step a moment longer, looking up at the sky. It hadn't gotten any cooler, but something about the way the air moved around that porch felt different. Less still. Back in town, the laughter had stopped, but the memory of the way she'd knelt unfazed and the way he'd stood unshaken that lingered. Long after the sun slid past its peak and the cicadas sang out from the brittle grass. Dry Creek remembered. The morning after the incident at the general store, Dylan Sprouse stood at the edge of the dry paddock behind his barn, brushing down his mare Pearl. The rhythmic strokes of the brush across her flank were steady, methodical like everything else in his life since Clara died. Pearl leaned into the pressure, her tail flicking lazily at fleecy slice, unconcerned with the memories curling behind her caretaker's eyes. Clara had been everything Dylan wasn't: talkative, warm, spontaneous. She had a way of turning breakfast into an event and silence into comfort. They were traveling back from her sister's in Fort Bridger when the stagecoach was ambushed. Bandits quick and without mercy. The driver took a bullet to the throat before he could speak. Clara was reaching for Dylan when the second shot tore through the canvas and found her. He hadn't spoken for nearly a week after burying her. That was 4 years ago. Since then he lived quietly on the edge of Dry Creek, tending horses, repairing fences, and only going to town when he needed to. He avoided crowds, ignored gossip, and tried not to remember the softness of Clara's Alsatian accent when she whispered his name. But yesterday's words to me, it sounds like home, still echoed in his head. Across town, Anka Vetrova was up before the sun, pouring water into a tin kettle over the stove. Her uncle Ezra sat by the window, squinting at a letter with a magnifying glass. I can't make out the stamp, he muttered. Anka took the paper gently. Montana, she said. From Mrs. Haynes. She asked if her son's still in the mines. Ezra grunted. Still writes every month. Still gets no answer. The old man had worked for the Overland Mail Company since before the war, writing routes most wouldn't dare. These days he barely left the porch. His right eye had gone gray from cataract, and the left wasn't far behind. But his hands still sorted letters with a precision that defied age. I'll take this one to the post, Anka said, slipping it into her bag. He caught her wrist gently. They'll be talking about you. I know. Ezra sighed. Don't let it in too deep. Folks around here forget quick, unless you give them reason not to. But Dry Creek did not forget, At least, not this time. By midday, the whispers had spread like spilled lamp oil. Sprouse spoke up for that foreign girl, one shopkeeper told another. At the saloon, a card dealer claimed he looked ready to draw over her. By supper, it wasn't just about what Dylan had said, it was why he said it. Some claimed he'd taken a liking to Anka. Others said he was still haunted by his wife and mistook Anka for a ghost of the past. And then Nora Blackwell came back to town. She arrived in a fresh coach from Chicago, her gloved hand first to exit, followed by her booted foot and a sweep of burgundy skirts. She was older now, sharper city polished, but her eyes still flicked with recognition the moment she saw Dylan's name chalked outside the smithy. Nora had once been the brightest flame in Dry Creek Mayor's daughter church soloist, the girl everyone assumed Dylan Sprouse would marry. That was before Clara, before Chicago. She made her way to her family's grand house on the North Ridge, but wasted no time collecting gossip like berries in her bonnet. "Who's this Anka girl?" she asked at the Mercantile. "Ukrainian. Lives with old Ezra," said Mrs. Langtry. "Oh," Nora smiled thinly. "Isn't he the one folks said ran messages for the Galician rebels before the war?" That evening, she dined with Sheriff Lyman Croft and his wife. Over roast beef and boiled potatoes, she laid her trap. "I find it fascinating," she said lightly, slicing into her meat, "how easily a woman can win loyalty just by being different, especially when no one asks what she might be hiding." Anka felt it in the glance at Sabasi, the pauses in conversation when she entered the Mercantile, the way Mrs. Haynes no longer waved from her porch. She began to take different routes into town, shorter conversations, quick errands. She avoided the general store completely, and she avoided Dylan Sprouse. Dylan noticed. He saw the way she no longer looked up when their paths crossed, how she turned the other way when he neared the post shack. He didn't blame her, not after the stir he'd caused, but it sat heavy in him, like wet sand in his boots. He found an excuse. A package slightly torn at the corner addressed to Ezra, but lacking return information. He knocked gently on the door near dusk. The light was golden through the cottonwoods, casting long shadows across the porch. Anka opened it, surprised. Her braid was slightly loose flour, dusted her sleeve. "I brought this," Dylan said, holding up the parcel. "Thank you," she said, hesitating. "You wish to come in?" He stepped inside. The air smelled of rye bread and chamomile. Ezra was dozing in the corner chair. Dylan handed her the package. "It's just thread," she said, recognizing the handwriting. "For mending." Seemed like a good excuse, he said. She looked up at him, then not with fear or shame, but with caution. "I do not wish trouble," she said. "You're not the one causing it." Silence stretched. Then Dylan spoke, voice soft. "My wife, Clara. She came from Alsace." Her voice never changed, not even after years here. Anka listened. She'd say sugar like it had a chi in the middle. He chuckled. "Drove my mother crazy, Tracy." Anka smiled faintly. "She taught me to listen different. Not for perfect words, for meaning." Anka nodded slowly. "My mother said the same. Words are not bread. You cannot eat them. But meaning can feed the soul." Dylan met her gaze. "Smart woman." She looked down at the package. "People here, they think I am hiding." "Are you?" She shook her head. "Only trying to live." "Then that's enough." Ezra stirred, then blinking. "Sprouse?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Ezra grinned. "About time you came by. Girl talks about you in her sleep." Anka flushed, but Dylan only chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." The tension softened. Dylan didn't stay long. Just enough to show he wasn't scared of whispers. Enough to remind her she wasn't alone. When he left, Anka watched him walk back through the dust boots, steady, shoulders easy. And for the first time in days, she breathed without bracing first. The night Ezra died, the wind came howling down from the northern ridge, like it had teeth. Dry Creek shuddered beneath the gusts. The cottonwoods creaked, and the loose window panes of the old post shack rattled like bones in a tin can. Inside, the fire burned low in the stove, and Anka was mending a coat sleeve by lamplight. Ezra had been coughing for days, wheezing worse at night. Anka had begged him to rest to let her take over the sorting and sacking, but the old man was stubborn as cracked sesame. That evening, he'd insisted on reviewing a stack of misrouted mail, claiming one envelope felt wrong in the hand. He was halfway through a curse about city clerks with the empty skulls when his breath caught. The letter fluttered from his hands as he slumped sideways in the chair. Anka was at his side instantly. "Uncle," she whispered, shaking him gently. "Uncle Ezra." His lips moved, just barely. "Don't let them find the ledger," he rasped. "They'll kill for it again." Then silence. Anka froze, tears springing to her eyes. "Ledger," she whispered. But his eyes were already glazed, staring at something far beyond the walls of the cabin. The next morning was bitterly cold, unusual for mid-autumn. Dylan came before the sun was high, having heard from the stable boy that something had happened up by the post shack. He found Anka kneeling in the yard beside a wrapped body, her hands clasped lips, moving in soft prayer. She didn't cry not in front of him, but her voice cracked when she said, "He is gone." Dylan took off his hat. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She nodded, still staring at Ezra's covered form. He spoke just before. "Do you want to talk about it?" She hesitated, then said, "He warned me. About a ledger. Said someone might kill for it." They moved Ezra inside together, laying him gently on the cot. Dylan fetched wood, while Anka sat at the table staring at Ezra's old mail trunk. Something about it felt heavy. That night, while Dylan kept watch outside, more out of instinct than necessity, Anka pried open the false bottom of the trunk with a carving knife. What she found chilled her more than the night air. Inside was a rolled, oil-stained map, marked with a faint red X far to the west of Dry Creek, near an old defunct mining camp called Lazarus Hollow. Beneath it, wrapped in wax cloth, was a leather-bound ledger filled with names, figures, and strange notations, all written in Russian. The map crackled in her hands. The ledger smelled of smoke and something darker. Outside, the horses stirred. Then came the knock, too hard, too fast. Dylan's voice called softly from the dark. "Anka, someone's out back." Anka shoved the ledger under a loose floorboard, just as the back window shattered. A masked man lunged through, blade in hand. Anka screamed. Dylan burst in from the side door, his rifle raised. The intruder spun, swinging wild. Dylan fired once, aiming low. The man crumpled with a scream, grabbing his thigh. A second figure bolted from the shadows outside. "Don't chase," Dylan growled, checking Anka's arm where a shallow cut bled. "We need to know who sent them." Anka Braith, shaking, nodded. They tied the wounded man and waited for the sheriff. But come morning, Sheriff Croft didn't seem surprised. "Some drifter," he muttered, barely glancing at the prisoner. "I'll handle it." But Dylan didn't miss the flicker in the sheriff's eye when he looked at Anka, or the way he lingered near the corner of the cabin where floorboards still sat slightly askew. After the sheriff left, Dylan turned to Anka. "I know someone who can help," he said. Red Clay arrived 2 days later, on a dust-covered pony hair, tied back, sleeves rolled to reveal muscled forearms, covered in faded ink. Part Cheyenne, part Irish, he was a tracker, a drifter, and Dylan's oldest friend. "You're in a mess," he said without preamble, flipping through the ledger with an expert eye. "This isn't just a journal. It's a ledger of payments, payoffs, names I recognize, and this," he pointed to the map, "that X. It ain't just a mine, it's where they buried the last payout." "Who are they?" Dylan asked. "People who don't like loose ends," Red said. "And this Ezra. He wasn't just a mailman. He was a runner. For information. This," he tapped the book, "is dangerous. Anka sat silently, arms folded. Can you read it all? Some Red replied. But I know someone who can do better. You trust me. She looked at Dylan. He nodded. Slowly Anka did too. They buried Ezra 2 days later, beneath the largest cottonwood near the creek. Dylan carved the cross himself. Anka sang something soft in Ukrainian, her voice trembling for the first time since his death. As they stood in the breeze, Red leaned close to Dylan. You know Croft won't let this go, he said. I've seen that look before. What's his stake? Croft. Red shrugged. He answers to Blackwell money. Always has. Dylan glanced toward town, where the sheriff's badge still held weight, but less honor than it once did. That evening, Croft sat in Nora Blackwell's parlor, swirling whiskey in a cut-glass tumbler. You were right, he said. She raised a brow. About the girl. The ledger. Ezra had it. Where is it now? Croft drained the glass. Still looking. But Sprouse is involved. That complicates things. Nora stood crossing to the window. Outside, the stars blinked faint through the smoke of town lamps. Then uncomplicated it, she said. I want that book. Croft didn't answer. But he would. They left before sunrise, while the mist still clung to the low grasses and the coyotes had not yet tucked in for the day. The wagon Dylan hitched was old, but sturdy, packed with supplies and one of Ezra's rifles. Red Clay rode ahead on his paint pony, scanning the trail with eyes that missed nothing. Anka sat beside Dylan, quiet gloved hands folded in her lap, the map tucked tightly into her satchel. The path west took them through canyons of dry sneezed and cottonwood-lined creeks, past carcasses of cabins long abandoned and fence posts half swallowed by must. The silence between them wasn't called. It was the kind of silence that grew when people had more trust than words. Around midday, as they rested beside a dry stream bed, Anka spoke for the first time in hours. My father died near Cheyenne, she said, staring at the brittle twigs in the fire. Railroad collapsed under him. He fell with the timbers. They said it was quick, but I don't believe them. Dylan looked up, not interrupting. My mother went north looking for work. I was 12. She never came back. Some say Indians took her. Others said worse. Red Clay, tending the horses, didn't flinch at the mention. He only said, not all disappearances are violent. Some people just stop belonging. Anka nodded slowly. So I learned to expect no one. Trust no one. Ezra found me years later. I was working in a laundry in Butte. He told me I spoke like someone who'd been alone too long. She smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. Dylan stirred the fire. He thought the world of you. They rode through the afternoon, the trail narrowing into shale and thorn. By sundown, they reached a bluff overlooking a dry ravine. Below, a lone shack stood tilted on its stone foundation. It looked half swallowed by the earth. Old surveyor's cabin, Red Clay said, dismounting. No smoke. No animals. Let's take a look. Inside, the place was musty and half-rotted. Rodents had claimed one corner. A table leaned drunkenly in the center, and mold crept along the baseboards. But then, Red froze. Someone's been here, he said. He knelt near the hearth and picked up a strip of cloth, part of a handkerchief singed at the edge. Nearby, a slip of paper was half-burned but legible. Cyrillic. Anka knelt beside him, reading the scrawl aloud. Lazarus Hollow, West Point, nightfall. Bring proof. Her voice caught. Someone else is after the cash, Dylan said grimly. More than one, likely, Red added. And they are close. That night they took turns keeping watch. Dylan sat with his rifle across his knees, ears tuned to every creak and whistle of the wind. Red slept lightly, knife under his pillow. Anka lay wrapped in her blanket, eyes open to the ceiling, the paper slip clutched in her hand. By morning, the wind had shifted. They rode hard through the next stretch, winding into high country where the air turned thin and every breath scraped the lungs. The landscape grew barren, bone-colored rocks, twisted trees and ravens overhead, like scattered ash. Then, just before dusk on the second day, they saw it. Lazarus Hollow. The remnants of the mine clung to the slope like broken ribs. Timbers collapsed inward, and rusted tracks snaked off into dirt. A single iron cart sat half-buried, wheel shattered. No sounds, no signs of life. "Looks dead," Dylan muttered. "Good," Red said. "Dead means it's quiet." They approached cautiously. Red checked for tracks. Anka and Dylan spread out, scanning the area. Near the western cliffside face, Anka found a pile of loose stones that didn't match the surrounding slope. She called them over. Together they lifted the rocks and unearthed an iron box, heavy, sealed with an old brass lock. "Jackpot," Red said. Dylan didn't smile. "We mark it. We don't open it yet." "Not here." They buried it again, more carefully this time. Red carved a small mark into a nearby boulder. Dylan made notes in a journal. The sun dipped below the canyon wall. Shadows stretched long. As they mounted their horses to return, Red paused. "You feel that?" he asked. Dylan nodded. "Eyes." Anka turned. The ridge above shimmered with the last light, but something darker shifted behind the rock. They rode faster than they'd come, and from the ridge, two riders watched them go. They returned to Dry Creek, under cover of dusk, dust-soaked and silent. The map, the box, the knowledge of what they had found, it all burned behind their eyes like afterimages from a fire. But danger had not waited. That night, Red Clay was ambushed. They took him outside the general store. Two men, one with a sheriff's star that no longer meant justice, the other with blood in his eyes. Sheriff Croft and Silas Blackwell, Nora's younger brother. Red fought like a wildcat, but the butt of a rifle cracked against his ribs, dropping him to the ground. Croft knelt beside him. "You've got a sharp eye, Red. Too sharp for a man who doesn't know how to keep it shut." Silas spat in the dirt. "Tell us where the box is." Red didn't flinch. "I buried it where your soul should be." Croft laughed dryly. "You always had a mouth." He leaned in. "Did Ezra ever tell you why he really moved out here? He found that mine 20 years ago. Blackwell paid him to keep it quiet. But the old man had second thoughts, tried to get the land recognized as public. So Croft gestured vaguely with his gun cleaned up. Silas's voice was low and venomous. "And now you and that foreign girl in Sprouse think you're going to rewrite the story." Croft knocked Red out cold. Back at the outskirts, Dylan and Anka were moving fast. They had planned to return the next day with tools, but now the town felt wrong. Off. Then Dylan caught movement in the trees, a flicker of something pale and fast. "Go," he said to Anka. "Head south. Take the creek trail." "What about you?" she whispered. "I'll draw them off. Meet me at the cottonwood." But no time. He kissed her forehead and ran the other way. Gunfire broke the stillness minutes later. Anka ran. The map slapped against her thigh. Inside the satchel, her breath ragged. Hooves thundered behind her once, but then faded. She dove behind brush, crawled under low brambles until the town disappeared entirely. She didn't stop until she reached a hollowed tree by the creek, one she and Ezra used to sit under. She waited. No Dylan. When Dylan came to the world was sideways. His head throbbed. Blood crusted above his eyebrow. He was lying in a barn, dusty shadowed, and someone was cleaning the wound on his chest. 2 moons, Red's sister, younger, sharper. She didn't speak, just focused on stitching with hands like steel. "You always pick fights with people who outnumber you?" she finally asked. Dylan grunted. "Habit. Red's gone." Croft took him. Dylan sat up too fast, winced. "Anka. Last I heard she was running. Smart girl." He nodded. "Can you get me back to the cottonwood?" 2 moons raised a brow. "That's where you're headed." After taking a rifle to the ribs, Dylan met her eyes. I said I'd be there. Meanwhile, Anka had hidden the satchel in a hollow log. She made her way into town disguised in a mourner's shawl, blending with a traveling wake. She slipped into Ezra's cabin to retrieve the ledger, only to find it gone. Then she heard a whisper. Miss Anka. From the shadows a tiny figure emerged. Johanna, the orphan girl she'd once fed at the bakery. Maybe 9 years old now, eyes too knowing for her age. They came looking for you. Took the book. Said it's locked in the old parsonage. Why are you here? I've been hiding. Waiting. Anka crouched. I need help. Can you get me inside? Johanna nodded slowly. If you promise to come back, I will. They crept to the parsonage at nightfall. The front was guarded, but the cellar window had rusted open. Johanna slid through, first, then unlatched the door for Anka. Inside, the air was stale. Dust danced in lamplight. In a drawer under the desk, wrapped in cloth, was the book. Footsteps echoed upstairs. Anka froze. Then she handed Johanna the satchel. Out the back, now. Johanna fled. Anka slipped into the shadows, breath caught in her throat, heart pounding like hooves. Silas came down the stairs talking to Croft. Just burn it, I say. No paper, no proof. Anka waited until they passed into the chapel, then moved. Fast, quiet, out the side door. She ran. Dylan was waiting by the cottonwood, hunched but standing. 2 moons had left him a horse and gone her own way. Blood soaked his shirt, but his eyes were clear. Then he saw her. Anka stepped from the trees, Johanna beside her, clutching the satchel. They said nothing at first, just looked. Then Dylan let out a long breath. You're here. You too. Johanna grinned between them. Told you she'd come back. Dylan ruffled her hair. You're something else, kid. Anka handed him the book. It's all here. Names, dates, deals. Dylan nodded. Now we bring it to light. She looked up at the cottonwood. The breeze whispered through its limbs. For Ezra. For all of them, Dylan said. And they stayed there just a little longer at the last safe place they had. The morning air in Dry Creek was brittle, like it had been cut from glass. Dylan rode into town beside Anka, his ribs still bandaged beneath his coat. Every movement hurt, but he rode tall. Behind them, Johanna clung to the saddle, horn eyes wide, while Red Clay followed from a side trail, hidden until the moment was right. They reached the town square just as the sun tipped over the rooftops. The streets weren't empty. People had gathered, drawn by whispers, by rumors, by the sight of the strange girl with the satchel, who walked with the wounded cowboy at her side. Merchants leaned out of their doorways. Miners stepped from saloons, wiping grit from their face. Even the preacher had paused mid-sermon to look. Anka stepped forward. She climbed the wooden steps of the old town platform, once used for public notices and sermons. Now it would bear something else. Dylan placed the ledger in her hands, and she began to read. In the year of our Lord 1869, she said, her voice steady. A contract was signed between Jeremiah Blackwell and one Sheriff Edmund Croft. The contract offered payment for silence. In exchange, Ezra Vetrova was to remain quiet about the Lazarus Hollow claim and surrender his deed. Gasps echoed. She turned a page. There is mention of a second payment to remove obstacles. And an entry, payment delivered, saddlebag marked. No witnesses left. Her voice didn't tremble, but the wind caught the edge of her shawl, and it fluttered like a flag of mourning. Ezra Vetrova was not just an old man. He was a witness, and he was murdered. A murmur rippled through the crowd, then a shout. Lies! Silas Blackwell stepped forward, flanked by 3 men with rifles. That ledger's fake. She's trying to stir up foreign trouble. But then another voice joined. From the saloon steps, old Miss Delaney raised her hand. I remember Ezra. He always said he kept a book. Then the preacher, that handwriting matches my wedding registry. Ezra wrote it. The town began to fracture before their eyes. Some shouted. Others stood stunned. A few turned away, ashamed. But many stood still listening, weighing. Anka stepped down. Her hands were trembling now, though she didn't show it. Dylan moved beside her. Then a click. She turned and found herself face to face with Nora Blackwell. Her once perfect hair now windblown, her dress dusty from running. In her hands, a pistol. Pointed. "I should kill you," Nora hissed. "For what you've done." Dylan froze. "Nora, no." Her eyes blazed. "You never saw me, Dylan." "Not really." "I waited. I tried. I listened to you talk about Clara and your dead mother, and I nodded. But you never looked at me like you look at her." She turned the gun toward Anka, hands trembling. "That voice, that awful foreign voice, it stole you." Anka stood still. "Then shoot." The crowd went silent. Nora's breath caught, her finger tensed. Then she lowered the gun. It clattered to the ground. "I can't," she whispered. "I thought I could. But I'm not like them." Tears welled in her eyes. "It was supposed to be me," she said. "You were supposed to look at me." Then she turned and fled. From behind the livery, Croft ran. Red Clay stepped out of the alley, his knife flashing once in the sun. He didn't stab. He tripped the sheriff clean, pressed his boot to the man's back, and called out, "Your sheriff's done running." 2 men in the crowd moved to bind Croft's hands. The people had decided. In the middle of the square, Dylan turned to Anka. She was shaking not from fear, but release. He took her face in his hands gently, reverently. "You did it," he said. "No," she said, "we did." And he kissed her. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But they stood still, quiet witness to something pure, in a town that had forgotten how to be clean. Blood still stained Dylan's shirt. But Anka's hands held his face like it didn't matter. Like the only truth that mattered now was the one they chose together. Spring returned slowly to Dry Creek, but when it came, it brought with it something long absent: renewal. The snow melted early that year, soaked quickly into the thirsty earth, and from it rose green shoots, yellow wildflowers, and the long grasses that the horses loved. The mine at Lazarus Hollow, once a secret, then a curse, was opened, not for greed, but for restoration. Under new agreements witnessed and signed by 3 counties, the profits were shared. A schoolhouse was rebuilt with timber from the old Blackwell barn. A water pump was installed near the south pastures. No single man held the deed. The town now belonged to itself. Anka remained. She took up residence in the old parsonage, its stone walls sturdy, despite the fire damage from long ago. With help from the townsfolk, many of whom once scorned her, she turned it into a small school. Each morning, a dozen children came with slates and worn books. They called her Miss Vetrovai. Her accent never faded, and she never tried to hide it. In her class, no one was mocked for how they spoke, or what they remembered, or where they had come from. Dylan never left either. The wounds he carried would never fade completely, but they healed. Some days he limped from the pain in his ribs, but his hands remained steady when guiding a colt through its first steps. He took in strays, both animals and young boys, teaching them the slow, patient rhythm of horse and man. He built a second barn with red clay. The 2 men often worked in silence, though the bond between them was undeniable. 2 moons brought herbs and stories, her laugh echoing through the canyons. Even Johanna, growing taller by the day, helped run the feed shed and recited poetry when no one was watching. There were no grand pronouncements between Dylan and Anka. No white dresses or town-wide feasts. Just a quiet understanding built over firelight, and long rides sealed with shared bread and glances that spoke of home. One afternoon in late April, Anka sat beneath the cottonwood tree now fully in bloom. Petals drifted around her like confetti, and nearby a group of schoolchildren laughed over a game of rhymes. She watched them with soft eyes. Then from the side, a raised voice caught her attention. A small girl, pale freckled, stood with crossed arms in front of a dark-haired boy. "Why do you talk like that?" the girl said. "You sound all twisted up, like you are trying to swallow your words." The boy's face fell. Before Anka could speak, another girl nearby whispered, "That's mean, Clara." But the first girl didn't budge. Anka Rose walked slowly to them and placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "Do you know," she said quietly, "when I first came here, people said I sounded like I had stones in my mouth." Clara blinked. "But someone stood up for me," Anka continued. "He said, 'To me it sounds like home.'" She knelt to the boy's level. "And to me, your voice does too." The boy's eyes widened. Clara flushed red. Then the petals fell again, soft and steady. That night, Dylan stood by the barn watching the sun fade over the hills. Anka came beside him, holding 2 mugs of warm cider. He took one, nodded his thanks. They watched the stars blink to life. "Was it always this quiet?" she asked. He smiled. "No, not until now." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I like it. Not silence, just peace." He wrapped an arm around her. Dry Creek didn't stay silent anymore. It murmured now, with children's voices, with hoofbeats, with laughter and lessons and the soft sighs of those who had lost and still chose to build again. The cottonwood tree bloomed heavier that year, and the wind carried the sounds of home. Spring returned slowly to Dry Creek, but when it came, it brought with it something long absent: renewal. The snow melted early that year, soaked quickly into the thirsty earth, and from it rose green shoots, yellow wildflowers, and the long grasses that the horses loved. The mine at Lazarus Hollow, once a secret, then a curse, was opened not for greed, but for restoration. Under new agreements, witnessed and signed by 3 counties, the profits were shared. A schoolhouse was rebuilt with timber from the old Blackwell barn. A water pump was installed near the south pastures. No single man held the deed. The town now belonged to itself. Anka remained. She took up residence in the old parsonage, its stone walls sturdy, despite the fire damage from long ago. With help from the townsfolk, many of whom once scorned her, she turned it into a small school. Each morning, a dozen children came with slates and worn books. They called her Miss Vetrovai. Her accent never faded, and she never tried to hide it. In her class, no one was mocked for how they spoke, or what they remembered, or where they had come from. Dylan never left either. The wounds he carried would never fade completely, but they healed. Some days he limped from the pain in his ribs, but his hands remained steady when guiding a colt through its first steps. He took in strays, both animals and young boys, teaching them the slow, patient rhythm of horse and man. He built a second barn with red clay. The 2 men often worked in silence, though the bond between them was undeniable. 2 moons brought herbs and stories, her laugh echoing through the canyons. Even Johanna, growing taller by the day, helped run the feed shed and recited poetry when no one was watching. There were no grand pronouncements between Dylan and Anka. No white dresses or town-wide feasts. Just a quiet understanding built over firelight, and long rides sealed with shared bread, and glances that spoke of home. One afternoon in late April, Anka sat beneath the cottonwood tree now fully in bloom. Petals drifted around her like confetti, and nearby a group of schoolchildren laughed over a game of rhymes. She watched them with soft eyes. Then from the side, a raised voice caught her attention. A small girl, pale freckled, stood with crossed arms in front of a dark-haired boy. "Why do you talk like that?" the girl said. "You sound all twisted up, like you were trying to swallow your words. The boy's face fell. Before Anka could speak, another girl nearby whispered, "That's mean, Clara." But the first girl didn't budge. Anka Rose walked slowly to them and placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "Do you know," she said quietly, "when I first came here, people said I sounded like I had stones in my mouth." Clara blinked. "But someone stood up for me," Anka continued. "He said to me it sounds like home." She knelt to the boy's level. "And to me, your voice does too." The boy's eyes widened. Clara flushed red. Then the petals fell again, soft and steady. That night, Dylan stood by the barn watching the sun fade over the hills. Anka came beside him, holding 2 mugs of warm cider. He took one, nodded his thanks. They watched the stars blink to life. "Was it always this quiet?" she asked. He smiled. "No, not until now." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I like it. Not silence, just peace." He wrapped an arm around her. Dry Creek didn't stay silent anymore. It murmured now, with children's voices, with hoofbeats, with laughter and lessons and the soft sighs of those who had lost and still chose to build again. The cottonwood tree bloomed heavier that year, and the wind carried the sounds of home. And maybe that's what home really is. Not a place, but a voice. A voice that doesn't match the crowd but still dares to speak. A voice that carries memory, longing, and quiet strength. In a world that often mocks what's different, Dylan Sprouse didn't see weakness. He saw something worth protecting. And Anka, she stayed. Not because the town changed, but because one man stood tall enough to remind it what kindness sounds like. In the end, it wasn't gold that healed Dry Creek. It was the echo of a voice that to someone finally sounded like home.